I wanted an RTX 3080 so badly from the moment that they were announced, and apparently so did everybody else in the world, especially the scalpers and the miners, so I didn't get one. I was on all of the deal sites and everything, but I had a budget. Honestly, the $700 MSRP was a lot of money. I was willing to go up to maybe $1,000. Eventually, I increased my budget to $1,200, and I just could not find one. So in September of last year, actually it was the end of August of last year, 2021, I went ahead and bought myself an RX 6800 XT from AMD. And I made a video about it on my channel. I switched to AMD from Nvidia. And I think it's my highest viewed video on my channel, and there's so many opinions in the comment section there. So many people are like, yeah, go Team Red, and so many people are like, you just made the worst mistake of your life. Well guys, now I can give you some actual full thoughts on what if I had bought an RTX 3080? Would my life have been infinitely better on Team Green? And guys, I want to make it clear here. I do not view myself on Team Red or Team Green. I'm interested in getting the best graphics card for my money. Now, you might be like, but you had a 6800 XT and now you bought a 3080. That's because my YouTube channel is growing and it's generating enough ad revenue that I can invest in more GPUs to test as a business expense. Let's make it absolutely clear. I was extremely happy with my RX 6800 XT. And while I was always curious about both the 4K performance, because my primary gaming I do is at 4K, where we do usually see Nvidia cards having a bit of an advantage, and I was interested a little bit in testing out a bit more ray tracing, and honestly, the real big one for me was DLSS. Because actually, I did a little bit of 4K gaming on my LG C1 OLED over here when I first got it, before I got the 6800 XT, and I was still on my RTX 2070. And to be able to have a class of card that really wasn't a 4K gaming card, be able to actually do some, 4K with DLSS gaming was really cool on the 2070. And I think DLSS is actually an extremely impressive technology. So in this video, I want to give you some of my full thoughts on this. The first day this arrived in the mail was the day that Elden Ring launched. So that was the first game I tested out. And it was actually pretty disappointing because I was not able to hold a locked 60 FPS at 4K max settings with the 3080. Now, that's not a title that features DLSS or FSR for that matter, but it's also not a game that features ray tracing or really even that impressive of graphics. So I was a little disappointed not to be able to lock 60 FPS on that. And I'm not even just talking about the stuttering issues the game has. It has tons of stuttering issues, but that's not what I'm going on about either. I mean just when it's not stuttering. It is able to hold 60 a lot of the time, but it does dip down into the low 50s in many scenes actually. Now, as soon as I made the video on my RTX 3080, I then popped in my 6800 XT and loaded into the same scene and was holding 60 FPS in a scene where the 3080 was getting about 55. Although as I walked around more, I did find an area where this dropped below 60 as well. And in the end, if I wasn't running my frame rate counter, I really couldn't tell you which game I was playing. I mean, sorry, not which game I was playing. I'm not an idiot. I couldn't tell you which graphics card I was using unless I loaded into like their software program or something like that. Because in a game that does not feature DLSS or ray tracing, my conclusion between the two GPUs is that it really doesn't matter which one you have. There's almost no perceptible difference to the actual end user who is not running like MSI Afterburner or some other performance monitoring thing to really be able to tell. Because yeah, in some games the 6800 XT is faster, especially at 1080p and 1440p. But in other games, the 3080 is faster, especially at 4K, but sometimes at 1080p or at 1440p. Also, I should be clear that this is the 12 gigabyte 3080 model, which seems to be kind of phasing out the 10 gigabyte. I'm not clear whether they're still making those or not. But while this isn't the 3080 Ti, it is 12 gigabyte like the Ti model. It's slightly slower than the Ti model, but it's actually faster than the 10 gigabyte model. And that's not just due to having more VRAM, so it's not being bottlenecked by the VRAM. It actually has more CUDA cores and an expanded memory bus or memory bandwidth or whatever you call that, because they changed the memory structure to give it the 12 gigabyte. So really this is like a slightly slower 3080 Ti more so than a 3080 10 gigabyte. It splits the difference, although usually a little bit closer to the Ti model. Which, by the way, then means that compared to the 10 gigabyte 3080, my 6800 XT would be even doing a little bit better. But again, we're talking such small percentage differences that in my testing, like I said, it's really, really similar. And it's almost imperceptible differences in the vast majority of titles. I have noticed some outliers. Like, for example, in Forza Horizon 5, especially when I'm running Smart Access Memory on AMD, and running ResizeBAR, don't worry, I'm not turning that off, on the Nvidia card, the AMD GPU really is actually significantly beating Nvidia here, although both of them are producing such good frame rates that once again, without running a frame rate counter, would you really notice? You really just notice the gameplay feels smooth and looks good. But the big elephant in the room here is really ray tracing and DLSS performance. And when I got the 3080, the first thing that I did after testing out Elden Ring, because I had to get my videos out quickly for, get that search traffic while it's hot on the YouTube channel, the next thing I actually loaded up was Cyberpunk, because I played Cyberpunk back on my 2070, and at that time I was gaming at ultra-wide 1440p, didn't have my C1 yet, and honestly, even though I had an Nvidia RTX card, which was pretty good for the time, I really couldn't run it with ray tracing. I could, but I had to use such aggressive DLSS that I felt like the image artifacting that occurred when I was doing it just simply was not worth the visual gain that you get from ray tracing in that title. Well, now I'm gaming at 4K, but hey, you got the 3080. That is way more powerful than my old 2070. So I was like, yes, we're gonna load into Cyberpunk. Had that 1.5 patch update, so things are looking good. They changed a bunch of stuff. Maybe I'll do a run through on a harder difficulty or something like that. And I started benchmarking it, and honestly, guys, it can't even run 60 FPS at 4K Ultra without ray tracing. Again, without DLSS, but let's be clear, even without ray tracing, and even though Nvidia has better 4K performance, it has better 4K performance, but it's still not unbelievable. So I wasn't getting a 4K performance that I was actually looking for here, even without turning on ray tracing. And once I turned on ray tracing, it's an utter slideshow until you use DLSS. The problem being that while DLSS quality, especially at 4K, it's better the higher resolution you are, looks incredibly close to native, and I have absolutely no problem using DLSS quality at 4K. It actually doesn't bring the frame rate up anywhere near where I would want to actually play the game at if I'm enabling a lot of the ray tracing settings at 4K. And again, to be clear, I do most of my gaming at 4K here, not 1440p. So at 1440p, I think the ray tracing is going to be a lot more usable, although you're still going to be needing DLSS in these heavy ray tracing titles like Cyberpunk. So I had to go incredibly aggressive on the DLSS if I want to actually max out the ray tracing, or do the ray tracing ultra setting, which doesn't even move the lighting up to psycho. And at that point, there was so much loss of detail, especially in motion, and especially in Cyberpunk specifically, on a lot of the straight lines that you'll see in pavement and in some of the buildings and things. When it's a still screenshot, DLSS seems to reconstruct it perfectly. But when you move the mouse, there's aliasing in those straight lines in a lot of situations. And I find it incredibly distracting. And there's just generally something that just doesn't feel right about the image when you use DLSS too aggressively. So I've got to be honest, guys, I'm going to wait on my Cyberpunk replay, maybe until a big expansion pack comes out and there's the 4000 series of Nvidia cards. Or we'll see what the ray tracing performance is like on the 7000th series from AMD. Because honestly, in heavy ray tracing titles like Cyberpunk and others, I just don't think we're there yet. If you have to run DLSS to a point where you're upscaling from 1080p or 720p on a 4K screen, even though it's honestly incredibly impressive what a good job DLSS does at upscaling that to 4K, it still just, in my opinion, is not worth the hit to the image quality that DLSS has. You gain something from ray tracing, you lose something from DLSS. And yes, guys, in some scenes, DLSS quality has certain elements to the image that do even look better than native, but it also has some elements of the image that look worse than native, like image ghosting. And in some titles like Cyberpunk, you do get some aliasing and motion and things like that. And like I said, in these heavier titles, you have to go way past DLSS quality in order to enable all of the maxed out ray tracing effects. And at that point, like I said, I really think you're just losing too much. So while ray tracing is something that Nvidia wants to be one of their major selling points, I've got to say I'm underwhelmed, and I'm going to wait for another generation of GPUs before I really am that into ray tracing. I do think ray tracing is the future, but I don't think it's the present. Future's coming soon, though, this year with our next generation of GPUs, and I'm excited to see what they can do. I'm hoping that 4K 60 with DLSS quality and not going below that with maxed out ray tracing will hopefully at least be a thing in the near future. I'd love to do it at native resolution without needing DLSS. Now let me keep talking about DLSS a bit longer though here, because I think that DLSS is the most impressive feature here, and it is something seriously considering if you're deciding between Team Red and Team Green. Let me actually say that when Elden Ring came out, and I was testing it out, I was actually also in the process of finishing up my first playthrough of God of War on PC. And I'd been playing it at 4K with maxed out settings on the 6800 XT. And that game did have some GPU utilization issues in certain scenes on AMD graphics cards. So when I did switch over to the Nvidia card, I did in certain scenes notice a bit more smoothness, and also testing out DLSS quality in that game was incredibly close to native, although I could still tell when it was on. It did have some disadvantages. That being said, I found DLSS quality to be so good at 4K in God of War that I did end up finishing out my playthrough with DLSS enabled, and I did notice that smoothing out the frame rates and feeling quite good, even with the frame rate counter off. So I really do like having DLSS as an option. And compared to FSR, well, for one thing, Nvidia can also use FSR. So while it's great that AMD developed that, that's not a exclusive feature. And I like that they don't make their features exclusive. But when you're making your purchasing decision, that is a bit of a problem, right? The Nvidia card can run FSR in games that have it and don't have DLSS. But when DLSS is available, I really do think DLSS is the better option. Although at 4K, the ultra quality FSR does look quite good. I do think I'm preferring the DLSS image in most titles. And then it's when you're running it more aggressively, like I said, to actually max out something like ray tracing in Cyberpunk, even though I said I still don't want to do it. I don't want to run it in performance mode or anything like that. The performance mode, upscaling from that low of a resolution on DLSS, is significantly better, like night and day difference compared to FSR trying to upscale from that same resolution. So at the lower resolutions, or at more aggressive settings at a high resolution like 4K, DLSS simply is a better technology. I would love to see AMD develop their own actual machine learning type competitor that uses temporal data, And all signs point to they probably are working on something like that. And even if they're not, we also have the wild card of Intel's XeSS technology, which should have fallback support for AMD and Nvidia using DP4A, rather than just using the Intel exclusive hardware acceleration. Although it will run better on Intel, and I'm very curious how much performance gain you'll get using the DP4A fallback, but that is a big question mark. Now, less important to me, maybe we could talk about, like, everybody's scared about the AMD drivers and all of that. Well, have I had a lot of drivers issues? Well, I've been gaming on this a lot and testing out a bunch of games on my AMD card for almost 7 months now, and I've had almost no issues. I have occasionally had a black screen in games. When it has happened, it has been extremely rare. For example, when playing Halo Infinite, if I was playing like a 5-hour play session, which wasn't often because I don't usually have that much time to sit down and do it, I might black screen once in that amount of time on certain drivers. Also, on one of the drivers that I installed, for some reason it would take a while to start up playing a video in Windows using the default Windows video player. Now, speaking of that, that's really about all the issues that I experienced. I think I had a black screen issue in Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition once as well, although I've tested it on a more recent driver and was no longer having that problem. Now, on the Nvidia GPU, though, I've also had some problems. When I was testing out ResizeBAR versus Smart Access Memory, I noticed an anomaly in Red Dead Redemption 2, where when I was running the benchmark at any resolution, but this was especially apparent at 1080p, the 3080 was just not fully utilizing and was getting very low frame rates, below 60 in some scenes in the Red Dead Redemption 2 benchmark. And what was strange was when I enabled ResizeBAR, it didn't have that issue. And I restarted my computer and did this several times, and this was repeatable. And my AMD card on the exact same system was not having that issue, regardless of whether Smart Access Memory was on or off. And so that was weird. So I'm saying NVIDIA has some driver issues too. I'm pretty sure that was a driver issue, and I bet if I tested out a different driver, I might not have seen that issue anymore. But in that video, I was just testing them out on their latest drivers, and that is what happened. In addition to that, speaking of the Windows built-in video player, I don't know what the issue is with that, but actually, I went ahead and downloaded VLC again, which I used to have but had gotten rid of, because I was fine with the Windows media player for what I was using it for. I went ahead and downloaded it again when I've been using my 3080 a lot, because I was having issues where, like, when I'd full screen the video, it would, like, look kind of washed out, but then when I had it as a smaller screen, it wasn't washed out, and then I tested it on my AMD card, and the video looked fine. So it wasn't the video, it was the playback, and it played back fine on my AMD GPU in the same computer, but it was having issues on the Nvidia GPU. More software issues. I don't know if this is really a driver issue, but software comparisons. And this is getting more into the productivity side of things. I capture gameplay using the built-in software from AMD, using AMD Relive, and I also use NVIDIA, is it still called Shadowplay? But they're captured through their GeForce experience. And my microphone has a lot of issues on the NVIDIA GPU, where my voice sounds kind of garbled, or like low quality, low bit rate, or sometimes even glitchy on the NVIDIA card. And it sounds absolutely perfect on the AMD card when every other thing that I'm doing on my computer is set the same. This is an RTX. This is an RTX 3080. Let's go ahead and test out the 6800 XT. Also, I've had some issues where I'm trying to capture some gameplay on my NVIDIA GPU. And I play back the video and it's just a black screen, but I can hear the audio. And that doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. And I haven't had that issue on my AMD GPU. Now, speaking of the gameplay recordings, I can get a good looking image from both of them. But the NVIDIA image can be captured at a lower bit rate for an equal visual quality, meaning that my file sizes can be smaller on NVIDIA, which then takes less upload time, which is nice, and still have it look just as good. But it's not that big of a deal for me on AMD. It's just a larger file size. For a live streamer, this would be a bigger deal, because that means that you can have a lower bitrate upload speed that looks, or let me put it this way, if they're uploading at a low bitrate, at the same low bitrate, The AMD image is probably going to look slightly worse than the Nvidia image through nvenc. And if you're a professional live streamer, that could be an issue. But if you're a professional live streamer, you should honestly probably have a 2 PC setup and be streaming and be uploading through a CPU encoder, to be honest. And if you're not a professional live streamer, then does it really matter that much if you're just kind of streaming for fun? Could be something to consider, though. NVIDIA also has the RTX voice options and things like that, which I choose not to use anyway, because for my use case, while it has a very good noise filter, it also can degrade the overall audio quality a little bit anyway, and I would rather just try to have a quiet environment for recording rather than use RTX voice. But I understand somebody in a noisy environment or streaming with a clicky keyboard or something like that. Things like RTX voice could be nice. Now, going into some other things, if you're in productivity applications, there are many applications that are just either only working with NVIDIA or have a bunch of acceleration and features that work better on NVIDIA. And that's just the state of the market. They have a larger market share. A lot of programs target NVIDIA support and don't target AMD support. And I'm not going to go into all of those possible programs. For me personally, it's kind of irrelevant. The only real programs I use are OBS, which seems to be working fine with both, and DaVinci Resolve, the free version, not the paid studio version. And DaVinci Resolve for my editing works fine on both. I know that it has, especially in the studio version, some NVIDIA-specific AI features, as well as you can render with nvenc. But to be honest, I bought a 5950X CPU for editing and rendering, and that does the job just fine, and I don't need to use nvenc for the rendering, and I don't use any of the AI accelerated features. And this might be too low of a sample size to count, but I have had no crashing or issues at all. Everything is perfectly smooth when editing on my AMD 6800 XT. But the few videos I've edited on my 3080, I actually did have one of them have an issue where it just wouldn't render, and I had to cut off part of the video and re-edit it and render it again. And it could just be a coincidence that I happened to have my RTX card in at the time. But I will say, the only big issue like that I've had in DaVinci Resolve did happen while I was editing on my Nvidia GPU, and I've actually edited fewer videos on that because I haven't had it as long. So in my personal experience from productivity standpoint, the only thing that's really helpful is the lower file size on the gameplay capture, but my mic sounds way better on the AMD card. So there's that. The software itself, I actually prefer that AMD has, in my opinion, a better looking software interface, and that they combine all of the stuff that NVIDIA splits into GeForce Experience and their control panel. And the control panel being kind of an outdated looking program, and the GeForce Experience looking more modern, but I don't like that you have to log into it with an account and are they tracking me? That kind of that's a little bit irritating. You don't need to log into it on the AMD side. And I love that AMD's overclocking features are built right into their software, and you can enable smart access memory with the click of a button. Whereas NVIDIA, you have to just turn it on or off in the motherboard, which is a little bit frustrating. You can check where the ResizeBAR is enabled in software, but you can't actually enable it or disable it off and on through software. Alright guys, my camera battery just died in the middle of a sentence, which means my video is probably going long. I think I was about to say something about how I noticed that NVIDIA's ResizeBAR support is not anywhere near as widespread as AMD's Smart Access Memory support, which just runs in any game, whether it helps your performance or hurts it. Whereas ResizeBAR, NVIDIA said that they would whitelist games where they know it increases the performance, which is great if they'd actually add it. But I've noticed games like Forza Horizon 5, which significantly benefit, but they don't enable it. You can add it through Nvidia Inspector, and I've mentioned that in other videos. But like I said, I think this video is getting long, so I need to finally kind of wrap things up. So, which GPU is better? Which one am I actually going to just use in my system when I'm doing it for personal use and not testing specific games? The main thing I noticed when I got the new RTX 3080 was that it was really hard to tell the difference. They're extremely similar. Quite frankly, I was underwhelmed. But that doesn't mean that I don't think it isn't better. Unless you're in a niche case, like for example, a Linux user, where AMD's driver support is, from what I've heard, to be clear, I'm not actually a Linux user, far and away better. I do think that the Nvidia card is overall better, with a few other losses. I think the AMD card is much more power efficient, and I love the built-in overclocking software, and I've been able to get some significant overclocking results on that card. Admittedly, I haven't played around overclocking the 3080 as much, but I do feel like there's some more headroom there and better power efficiency on the AMD card. That's fun to play around with. And again, there's specific cases, games, and resolutions where it has a significant performance advantage. But overall, they're both performing so well that I think you'd be happy with either one. And your biggest difference and deciding factor should be the price. But how much more does it make sense to pay for my 3080? Overall, now that I own both, I'm very happy that I didn't buy like a $1,700 RTX 3080 when I got my $1,200 RX 6800 XT. I don't think that price gap makes any sense, and the 3080 is not that much better. In fact, like I said, the main difference in my mind is DLSS. And even then, currently, I try to avoid using it except for maybe the quality setting at 4K in specific games. Since I game at 4K, I find that the ray tracing performance still isn't really where I'd want it to be to make it a big deciding factor in my purchase. And it'll probably be the hopefully next gen, but maybe even the gen beyond that, where I'd really want to enable ray tracing and not find it too much of a performance hit, even on the Nvidia software, even for Nvidia's performance there, which is admittedly better than the Radeon GPU. But one thing is the longevity of the cards, and I actually think that that's going to be the real strength of DLSS, because as the cards age, DLSS really is nice as far as if you just consider it as basically turning down a graphics setting. The image is going to look a little bit off in some cases, a little bit of ghosting, a little bit of shimmering in motion, that type of thing, but drastically increase your performance. And so I think in years to come, that could help out. Also, if you're looking at the VRAM capacity difference, I think the 10 gigabyte 3080 is actually concerning. And that was one of my main hesitations when I originally wanted a 3080. The 12 gigabyte model like I have, in addition to the slightly increased performance, I do think that little bit of extra VRAM headroom is extremely welcome and makes me less concerned about its longevity and the amount of time that I think somebody would want to hang on to that card. Because realistically, you'll have to start turning down settings or, like I said, using DLSS in the future anyway. And both of those things, turning down settings and using DLSS, should reduce the amount of VRAM required to run the game. That being said, having extra VRAM, when you look at cards in the past and their longevity, having that extra VRAM is never a bad thing. And the 16 gigabytes on the 6800 XT is really nice. Overall, the current pricing, like I said, I think will dictate which one makes the better buy. As of the time of filming, you can buy, I think I just bought it, a 6900 XT, which would actually be outperforming my 6800 XT, of, not blowing it out of the water, but noticeably better, for I think it was $13.50 on Newegg. A little promo code, so it's not a permanent pricing. Whereas Newegg is also having around that price on their RTX 3080s. So it's looking like you can get a 6900 XT for about the price of the 3080. Now, I'm curious if we'll start to see the price on the 6800 XT dropping as we're starting to see GPU prices steadily trending down. We're still nowhere near MSRP, but they are coming down. So if they're around even pricing, I do think go with the Nvidia card, but I think that I'd only pay maybe $100 more for it. $200 would be pushing it unless you're just like really into ray tracing or something like that. And as far as which one I'm going to use in my PC, I mean, honestly, I'm playing Elden Ring right now, and I do think the performance is better there. So I might be Team Red until I play a game that actually has ray tracing settings I might want or require DLSS. Interesting. But honestly, like I said, they're both great. I noticed a few other tiny little differences, but this video is getting really long, and I should probably wrap it up. You guys argue about all this in the comment section. I'm sure you have a lot to say. I hope all of you have an excellent day.